supposed to be and what it is not. And essentially the bulk of the talk will be a general overview of what depression is, what its treatments are, and how we can prevent it. And then, just to give you a heads up, I will be posing questions for you to discuss amongst yourselves for a few minutes, and then we'll talk about it in a group setting, and kind of that'll be how we'll do the Q&A. And I'll finish it up with some take-home messages. So I joined the MCD department in 2009, and I studied a brain control parasite called Toxoplasma gondii in the Eisen and Roby labs. I was investigating from a neuroimmunological perspective the loss of innate fear in cats in mice following infection. I graduated in 2015 and was hooded by a Jedi Knight, Mike Eisen, of course. And now I'm a joint postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health in the Department of Mental Health and Geisinger Health System, which is located in central Pennsylvania. And what I do now is I use medical informatics and human genetics to better understand depression and its treatments and outcomes. I also consult for 3 companies that are interested in using informatics, digital therapeutics, and machine learning to better predict and treat and deliver care for depression. So the reason why I'm here is due to, unfortunately, some very tragic losses and some of the actions that were spurred by these losses. So when I was a student in the MCD grad department, in 2013, we lost a classmate, Paul Gertz, to depression and suicide. And in fact, there was a suicide at every level within just our department. A faculty member, a postdoc, and an undergrad were all lost to suicide that same year. So myself and a number of other MCD students got together in the wake of Paul's death and tried to figure out what we could do to make it better for future generations, for other students. And what we did was we created what you now know as the MCD Grad Network. And we wanted to help other students in the department provide advice and support so that perhaps they would be better prepared than we were to balance the work of our graduate studies and our health. So that was great, but tragedy has struck again this year. We lost Chris Alvaro to depression and suicide. And because action is my coping mechanism, I have been back at Johns Hopkins working with graduate students there to establish a school-wide School of Public Health mental health grad network, modeled after what Chris helped found here. And so in conjunction with this, I've also been working with MCD faculty and the MCD grad network here at Berkeley to figure out what we can do to cultivate mental health awareness. And in line with that, I was invited to give this talk. So what this talk is meant to be is just a brief mental health introduction, emphasizing specifically depression, and I'll tell you why in a bit. And it is only the beginning of an ongoing conversation about mental health literacy, culture change, and response preparedness. What it is not is a comprehensive knowledge and response training. We can't cover everything that needs to be known, and I can't put all of that into a nutshell for you today. It also is not a research talk. So if you want to know more about what I do on a day-to-day basis, find me later on in the retreat, and I'd be happy to talk to you about that. So why depression? Depression is 16% of all people will suffer from a major depression at some point in their lifetime. It is the most common mental illness. And depression is the leading cause of disability worldwide based on years lived with disability. So there are other, usually infectious diseases that can cause high mortality. Depression has the highest morbidity because people live with it for so long and it dramatically impacts their lives. And we've lost 2 people to suicide, but I'm talking about depression today because mood disorders, such as unipolar and bipolar depression, underlie 80 to 90% of all suicides. And what we found is that the most effective way to prevent suicide is actually to treat the underlying mood disorder, which the most common is depression. However, if someone is actively suicidal or contemplating suicide, the two most important things to be done are to remove lethal means, such as guns and pills that they might use, and for that person to avoid substance use. So alcohol and cannabis highly increase the risk of someone completing suicide. So now, what exactly is depression? And the first thing that comes to people's mind is like, well, is it just feeling sad, feeling down, and it's something that you can just get over? Depression is not that. Depression is actually, while grief and depression have overlapping aspects, depression manifests with a wide variety of symptoms that may actually surprise you. Its best recognized symptom relates to mood. And so you can experience depressed mood, you can have feelings of guilt, hopelessness, worthlessness. In the academic setting, I think we talk about imposter syndrome as if it is just a normal thing that everyone has to deal with, but it can be a signifier of an underlying mood disorder. That's a much more serious problem. And so you can also experience decreased interest or pleasure in activities you used to enjoy. So this is called anhedonia. And it can be very distressing to people who realize that they don't enjoy the food they used to, they don't enjoy the activities they used to, they don't enjoy going out with friends anymore. But what some people don't know or realize is that depression can also result in agitated or irritable mood. And this is especially true with bipolar depression. And what is quite surprising to a lot of people is that you can actually feel nothing at all. There's a vacancy or lack of emotion, lack of response of anything. And many people don't associate that with depression. So depression also has physical symptoms. And so particularly noticeable thing from when I was a grad student during quals was change in weight. About half of my class gained weight and about half of them lost weight. There's also changes in the amount and the quality of sleep. So people can be needing more and more sleep or develop insomnia. But in general, the quality of sleep goes down tremendously. So anxiety is one of the most highly comorbid diseases along with depression. And so anxiety symptoms involve a lot of physical features such as heart racing, headaches, migraines can be induced, hyperventilation. And then there's a lot of gastrointestinal problems. So changes in appetite, either wanting to eat a lot more than you normally do, eat different foods, or having no appetite whatsoever. And development of gastrointestinal pain is really, really common, and that's something that people might seek care for, but not report all the other signs and symptoms of depression that they're experiencing. There's general somatization that occurs with depression as well, and so people can have a feeling of heaviness or pain throughout their whole body, any place, and they can experience a loss of energy and become easily fatigued. And one of the most noticeable and dangerous symptoms is an increase in substance use. So a sudden increase in alcohol or cannabis use can be a symptom of depression. And there can also be changes and reduction in personal growth. And depression can also change the thoughts you're having. So this, for scientists such as ourselves, can be particularly scary because our brains are what we use every day for what we do. And so if you develop thought disorder, you can experience slowness of thought or speech, have trouble finding words. You can't speak at the same rate you used to be able to. You can develop paranoid or obsessive thoughts. And while worrying about being scooped is something we all kind of have to deal with a little bit, if you are constantly thinking about that with racing, worried thoughts, that can be a sign of depression. And then, obviously, the thoughts of harming or killing oneself is a huge, huge red flag and should be, you should tell people immediately. If someone divulges this to you, make sure that you do everything that you can to get them the help they need at once. So I've described a whole variety of signs and symptoms, but what actually makes depression a disease? It's actually quite simple. Symptoms have to be consistent, although not constant necessarily, for at least 2 weeks. Usually it's much, much longer than this. And these must represent a significant change in a person's normal experience. So some people are just crotchety, and if they're irritable, that's just their personality. If it's not a change, that's fine. But, you know who that is. The third piece of it has to be that a social, occupational, educational, or some other important functioning must be negatively impacted by these changes as well. So now let's talk about what physically underlies depression. Depression is a real biologically driven disease, and it's not well understood in the sense, as many of the things that we study are not well understood, but there is a fair amount known about a variety of systems that do play a role. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. And what I find interesting, most interesting about depression is that it may be a feature, not a bug, in the sense that there are circumstances where your own body induces depression-like symptoms intentionally. So I want you to think back to the last time you were sick with the flu. You probably had low energy, you didn't want to be around other people, you had changes in your sleep and maybe your appetite, you were probably achy all over, and couldn't concentrate or think quickly anymore, right? So your immune system, not the flu virus, is what is causing those signs and symptoms. This is mediated, this has been shown to be mediated by a host of inflammatory cytokines that are listed here. But if these effects are initiated at the wrong moment or for the wrong amount of time, then we're talking about disease. So the endocrine signaling pathways are also known to result in depression symptomology. More than half of all hypothyroid patients have comorbid major depression, and by treating the underlying thyroid disorder, the depressive symptoms are actually ameliorated. The HPA axis dysregulation has also been implicated in the etiology of depression, and in fact, chronic stress resulting in corticosteroid release may be interacting with the inflammatory pathways that I just described and cause dysregulation. And then we also know that nutritional, sleep, and exercise deficiencies can play a major role. By treating nutrition or sleep deficiencies, concurrent depression symptoms can also be treated. And many exercise studies have also shown that, likely again through the anti-inflammatory processes, depression symptoms can be treated and go away. And so finally, you may be familiar with depression involving the serotonergic neural pathways due to the wide use of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, or SSRIs. And briefly, I'll say that the theory goes that serotonin depletion results in reduced firing and thus reduced brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And so two very effective ways to treat depression, SSRIs and electroconvulsive therapy, are known to increase BDNF and promote neuroplasticity. Unfortunately, we really don't have terribly more detailed models than that. But I'll work on that with my research. And so another piece of depression is looking at the genetics. And so, so depression does have some genetic component, but it's not terribly simple. Twin studies have shown that depression is about 35% heritable, but when we do genome-wide association studies looking at the common variants throughout the entire genome, it turns out that it's very much like height, a highly polygenic condition. And for my work, we have here calculated polygenic risk scores for depression. And we did find that this significantly correlates with whether they've been diagnosed with or treated for depression, the blue, purple, and red groups, and yellow groups, versus not being ever treated for depression. However, as you can see from the wide variant, looking at 20,000 SNPs, common variants only explains 2% of the variance and prediction. So I will say that if you have a family member that has suffered from depression or bipolar disorder, you are at greater risk, and so you should be vigilant of that and keep track of yourself and make care plans ahead of time, because you are at greater risk. So now the question, why is this relevant to this particular audience? There are two major reasons, age and stress. And so the age of onset is highest in those between 14 and 24, and then again from 45 to 55, and extreme chronic stress can trigger it. And now there have been a series of studies that have specifically looked at surveying graduate students in recent years. And all of these show that there are higher rates of depression and anxiety than in the general population. So most recently, in 2018, there was an international study that demonstrated that 39% of graduate students scored moderate to severe depression. And this is in comparison to an expected 6.7% in the general population. And 41% scored moderate to severe anxiety versus 6%. These are clinical indexes for both depression and anxiety. In this particular study, they showed that males were a little bit better off than females, and females were a little bit better off than people who identified as transgender. Last year, Johns Hopkins released a mental health task force survey that they partnered with the American College Health Association. And what they found was that 44% of graduate students experienced hopelessness in the previous 12 months to the survey. 36% felt so depressed it was difficult to function, and close to 60% felt overwhelming anxiety. And then Berkeley itself, in 2014, released the Graduate Student Wellbeing Report, and they, looking specifically at the biological sciences, because they broke it out by departments, found that biological sciences graduate students reported 43 to 46% were depressed. And at Berkeley, there was no gender gap. However, LGBTQ and non-white identifying students were worse off. And so I want to take just a second and talk about the demographic differences that we see in the rates of depression. So while everyone in grad school is experiencing the inherent stress involved in this training or being a faculty member, certain individuals and certain groups are prone to experience additional stresses. So women are at much higher risk of experiencing harassment, sexism, sexual harassment, and sexual violence. People of color are more likely to experience racism and discrimination, and LGBTQ plus individuals tend to experience marginalization and harassment. And so it's important to keep in mind the lived experience of different people and different groups that might be exposed to different kinds of stresses that not everyone is. And it's not just graduate students that experience stress that seem to have higher rates of depression and anxiety. A study here that was done on surveying Mensa members, they have to score in the 98th percentile or higher on IQ tests in order to be in Mensa. What we see here is that yellow is the national average, the shortest bars. Orange is formally diagnosed with a mood disorder, and red includes those who are self-diagnosed but haven't sought formal diagnosis or treatment. The good news is that depression is highly treatable. 80% of major depressive episodes respond to standard treatment. But awareness, early identification, and early treatment are key to getting better. So the average person waits 6 to 8 years to seek treatment. And during this time, the depression will get worse and worse, and other comorbid disorders will develop, complicating the recovery and delaying the treatment response in those individuals. And so what's also been studied and found is that community support and encouragement is hugely impactful for seeking care, sustaining treatment, and ultimately recovery. And so if you are not currently suffering from severe depression, but want to utilize prevention strategies, you can, it's really great to create a personalized self-care routine or set of things that you know will help you when you do become stressed. And so this can include taking a mental health day, building in an exercise routine, getting out in nature, massage or acupuncture. Meditation has been particularly helpful for myself and many others I've talked to. If you eat a cleaner diet, you're less likely to develop depression. Depression responds to light therapy. So if anyone happens to drop down in your mood or experience any of these signs or symptoms in the winter months, getting a light therapy box may help prevent that. And one of the things that the MCD Grad Network realized as we were starting to talk to one another about like how we coped and what we did that really helped, centered around picking up new activities and skills. So I learned to play the mandolin in grad school. Some of my other friends were avid skiers and rock climbers. Some other people I knew started to learn to paint or crochet. Adam Session, who some of you know, took welding classes at the Crucible. And other folks adopted pets, cats, dogs, and a lot of volunteering and gardening also came up. But one thing to know and to realize is that if you are starting to struggle, it's really important not to drink. It is a depressant, a central nervous system depressant, and runs a serious risk of making things worse. So drink when you're happy. If, however, you're getting to a point where you and your friends and your colleagues are starting to be a little more worried that you have developed depression, it's really simple for graduate students to get help and get in. You call CAPS at this triage telephone number, and they will do a 15-minute call with you. They will set you up with a psychologist to go do an intake with, and then they will give you a referral to start weekly treatments. I have a personal recommendation that it turns out evidence shows that if you have the right therapist is more important than is one of the most important things. And so if you set up 2 to 3 different intro sessions with different psychologists as you get started, you're more likely to find a therapist that's going to work for you, and you're going to have a much quicker recovery. And so if you and your therapist decide that medication is something you want to consider as well, you would get referred by your counselor to see a psychiatrist. And then if you have just depression, they would probably start you with SSRIs, which are incredibly safe and highly effective for most forms of depression, but they do take a few weeks to see an effect and may require trying a few different types because of unexpected adverse events that at this point we don't have the precision medicine to predict who's going to have weight problems or other issues that might make you not want to take or tolerate the first SSRI they try you on. And then for bipolar depression, it's really important to figure out if you have unipolar or bipolar depression, because people who suffer from bipolar depression taking SSRIs can induce a manic episode. And this can be incredibly dangerous. And so for bipolar depression, lithium is the go-to. It does have some toxicity though, and so not everyone can take it. And Lamictal is the backup. And Lamictal is actually the first thing that people go to for bipolar 2. And then if unfortunately you've reached a point where you have severe depression, electroconvulsive therapy is actually has an incredible response rate, 60 to 80%, depending on your diagnosis, your age, etc. And it can have extremely fast results. Within 2 weeks, people will go from the worst form of depression to very mildly depressed and be able to engage in other less invasive kind of procedures in order to get back on track. So this is the portion of the talk where I'm going to ask you to get into groups of 3 or 4, turn around, kind of settle in and figure out some people you want to chat with for the next 5 to 7 minutes. And I will read these questions out loud while you assemble and to cover up the awkwardness of that transition. So these are the questions you're going to be asking and talking to each other about. Who knows someone who has depression, bipolar disorder, or thought about